afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Saffron Walden CLP's celebration of International Women's Day that you all know was started in America in 1909, that called for basic rights like voting rights. I'm Sanjukta Ghosh, your host, as well as Women's and Policy Officer, who will begin the session for you. Our discussion theme today is equality, work, and empowerment. That is chosen following the UN celebration of the International Women's Day as well. And that theme kind of ties up with the issues of specifically this year about women's leadership in all its forms and calling for women and feminists across the world to claim their space in leadership and decision-making. This is something I will elaborate as well during the panel discussion that we will have. And this kind of theme is also quite symbolic of the global significance of sisterhood, especially in the context of COVID, as well as the social reconstruction that we are facing. Also, the theme draws from the Labour Women's Network, of which Labour directly is involved, many of the women members, especially the kind of conference that we will have soon in June, where the spirit is really to bring diverse voices together. So by diversity and diverse voices, I don't mean just color, but views of women that range from positions of power to kind of out of the box, non-traditional roles as well. And that is something, again, I will focus in the panel discussion, what and how those non-traditional roles matter and why we need to constantly highlight those in our current agenda, as well as progress to campaigns. So non-traditional roles that cover grassroots community, as well as directly related to homes as well. Because with COVID and the reconstruction as the crucial agenda, we also want to seriously engage with inclusivity, increasing global cooperation in the policy domain, an aspect that came out today as well, just before this meeting in the London International Women's Day celebration that I was also present in the morning today. So, so finally, I want to set right at the beginning a kind of a tone for intersectionality, which is something that we encourage in our Uttlesford Women's Group, talking specifically about how women are impacted by issues of class, race, disadvantages, and a disproportional support system that exists. So I want to remind all of you when we talk of space that this is also a safe space, and the program is being recorded for posting on social media. So you're welcome to keep your cameras on or off and use the chat function to communicate during questions and answers only, which you will find right at the bottom under more, and you can always use the chat button. So with that, I would like to invite our guest keynote speaker, Olivia Blake, Labour MP for Sheffield Hallam, and a member of Public Accounts Committee and chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Special Educational Needs and Disabilities. So that's a great moment to start, I think, with what I've introduced. I look forward to you, Olivia. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me along today to your International Women's Day event. I am a newish MP for Sheffield Hallam. And before being an MP, I was actually deputy leader at Sheffield City Council. And before that, a biomedical science. So not a traditional route into politics at all. But I have a particular interest in finance and how government spends money, the impact that has on local services, and also issues like ethical procurement, all the way through to transparency. So that's why I've become a member of the Public Accounts Committee. And I think it's fair to say that if this last year shows us anything, it's women have usually been at the sharp end of any social or economic crises, and COVID is absolutely no exception. It's for that reason that today I'll address most of what I say to the events of the past year and what they mean for women, but I also want to say what faces us in the future, namely the climate crisis. But before I do, it's important to say that the austerity of the previous decade was devastating for our economy, our public services, our health and social care and social security systems. The damage it inflicted not only left them poorly positioned to weather a global pandemic, it left women more vulnerable to the shocks caused by coronavirus. That's borne out by what people say now, and according to the Women's Budget Group, while 26% of men say they have been negatively affected by the crisis, the figure for women is at 30%. And no wonder, the nature of work in the UK is profoundly gendered. According to the TUC, the three sectors hit hardest by coronavirus are retail and wholesale, accommodation and food, and manufacturing. Taken together, they account for 70% of the jobs lost under COVID. Of these three sectors, two, retail and wholesale and accommodation and food, have a workforce which is majority women. We've all seen the disproportionate effect of the coronavirus crisis on Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities. Predictably, the employment situation is also worse for Black, Asian and minority ethnic women. Before COVID, this group of workers was already the least likely to be employed. Between Q3 in 2019 and Q3 in 2020, employment for BAME women collapsed by a further 17%. Last year, I spoke to theatre makers and creatives as part of my former role as a PPS on the DCMS team, and they explained that they were worried for freelancers in the sector, especially BAME, Black and minority ethnic theatre makers. Their fears have been confirmed, and according again to TUC figures, in the arts and entertainment sector, employment for Black and minority ethnic women has crashed by a staggering 44%. Many of you will know of the great trade union leader, Mary MacArthur. And for those who haven't, MacArthur led the Cradley Heath chainmakers in their famous 1910 strike against low pay and exploitation. She was one of the first women to sit on the National Executive Committee of the Shop Assistants Union, and she was the General Secretary of the Women's Trade Union League. MacArthur is known for saying women are unorganised because they are badly paid and poorly paid because they are unorganised. Sadly, her words ring true again today. The sectors that have been hit hardest by COVID are also poorly unionised, with people in insecure part-time contracts and 0 hours, and many of them not being entitled to statutory sick pay. Given the larger proportion of women in these sectors, it is no surprise that women, especially younger women, are generally more likely to be furloughed than men, missing out on opportunities while they're in furlough as well. We're also likely to have our salaries topped up, not have our salaries topped up to over the 80% by our employers, which is shocking. And women taking up the self-employed income support scheme and the businesses that have been falling through the gaps on that have affected women too, with women being 10% less likely to apply for those schemes and get the funding. We can't even tell what the effect has been on the disparity between men and women's pay during this period, because the government has ended the statutory requirement for businesses to report on the pay gap. So one thing is clear, women have disproportionately been affected in sectors where we're least able to organise and defend ourselves. That's before we even consider social care and the NHS. In both, again, the workforce is overwhelmingly women. Not only do women in the care sector risk shortages of PPE, care workers are also on low pay, 0 hours contracts, and sometimes, even in this sector, are ineligible for statutory sick pay. The poor pay, insecurity, coupled with governments treating social care as a poor relation to other services, have made the care sector an engine for transmitting the virus. The tragic loss of life we've seen in care homes is a horrific consequence of that toxic combination and not valuing women's lives. This week's budget has shown that the government has learnt nothing from the failures of the past year or the past decade. In a speech that lasted about an hour, Rishi Sunak said nothing about social care. I couldn't believe it. He also conveniently failed to mention a cut of 30 billion for the NHS. And on the other hand, he's given NHS workers a pitiful pay rise, whilst he's also pushed an extra 1.3 million of the poorest people into paying tax. Women are also disproportionately affected by the public sector pay freeze. 2/3 of the public sector workers are women. But it's not just about pay. The government have nothing to say about the wider structural problems in our economy that have affected women most over the last 10 years. Last year, the economy contracted by 10%. That's after a decade of stagnating growth and wages caused by underinvestment and rising levels of insecurity and casualisation in our labour market. On Wednesday, we had no serious plan to reverse that trend. Much has been made of Rishi Sunak's Green Investment Bank, but I'm afraid it's not enough. He's only committed a tiny 12 billion to it. And to put that in perspective, the business consultancy LCP have estimated that we're 100 billion short in the amount it will cost to reach net zero aspirations for 2050, never mind the stretch target of 2030. We need a serious plan to defend living standards in the wake of the COVID crisis, to get our economy moving again, and to build a net zero and ultimately zero carbon economy fit for the 21st century. It shouldn't be the lowest paid workers, key workers, nurses, and the unemployed who bear the cost of the pandemic. And it shouldn't be women. Instead, it should be workers who lead this change. We need a proper investment in a Green New Deal that includes everyone, in renewable energy, transport infrastructure, green retrofitting and housing to create sustainable jobs for the future and for future generations who have been massively impacted by the coronavirus as well. That should include an industrial strategy, which again, was quietly ditched this week for our manufacturing sector, and a rapid expansion of workers' rights so that those workers in sectors like retail and wholesale or food and accommodation no longer have to live through the insecurity of low pay, 0 hours and no statutory sick pay. The coronavirus has shone a light on problems in those sectors and more, including garment making. But a Green New Deal, I think, can be part of the fix for this. But to do that, to do any of this, we'll all need to be a bit more like Mary MacArthur. We'll need more women who will do as women have always done through our history and lead our movement. Women who have led pickets, the marches, and even political revolutions. I hope on this International Women's Day, we not only remember that radical tradition, but fight for it to continue, because we only have one planet and we all have to fight for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for this really kind of a broad spectrum of causes, as well as how disproportionately different sectors that you've brought out here. Before I kind of jump in and ask any question, I would like to open this to the floor. So if anyone has any comments to make or any questions, please do so. We have about 10 minutes of Olivia's time because she has another event to go to. So I would like anyone to raise any points you'd like now and unmute your microphones, please. Any questions?
Can I ask something?
Yeah, please.
Hello, Olivia. Thank you very much for talking to us today. You mentioned about women leading the way and demonstrating and picketing and things like that. One of the things I'll be talking about, I know you won't be here, but it is about the state pension age rises. And there has been a great deal of picketing and protesting and marches about this, but we seem to be invisible in the media, so we don't get the coverage of, admittedly we're not the same size as you know, the environmental protests and things, but we just don't get the coverage at all. And we are starting to see that people are hearing us, but how can a smaller group of women, particularly badly affected by it, how can we make noise that people will listen to?
I think that's a really important point, actually. And, you know, in my time at the council, before I became an MP, you know, I was supporting the WASPy women, as they were calling themselves at that point, in the city, on International Women's Day about 4 years ago. And I think we dyed the fountains purple to try and in the city centre to try and raise awareness of the campaign and get actually the media to pick it up, because they were really struggling to get their voice heard locally. So that did get a pick up, but, you know, it hasn't really led anywhere. I think that, you know, in the last Labour manifesto, we did have a commitment. I know it wasn't as strong as some wanted, but I think it was obviously better than the situation we're in now. And since becoming an MP, I've continued to meet with women who have been unfortunately affected by these changes. And, you know, I think it's just really important that we continue to put pressure on and work together as much as possible. I think the government are kind of hoping that this issue will just disappear and go away and people will give up. And I really hope that that doesn't happen. Because
Ian Duncan Smith is notorious for having said that to his staff, to the DWP staff, to say, do not engage with these women, they will go away. He said this in 2013, and he's been sadly mistaken, Mr. Bond, in that assumption, because we're not going away.
Exactly.
And in fact, the cohort of people now affected is just getting bigger, as those of us born in the 60s also suddenly, and they are still suddenly coming upon it. So we demonstrated, for instance, at the Media Centre in Manchester, Media City, and we were a big group, and Andy Burnham came and talked to us there as well. And we're right outside the BBC, and they just closed all their blinds and refused to even acknowledge we were there on that day. And there was a lot of us. It's very difficult, very frustrating that it's not a sexy topic, is it?
No, I mean, pensions usually isn't that a sexier topic, I suppose. But I would just say my advice is always just persist.
Yes.
You know, I used to be involved in a living wage campaign, and it was so frustrating because it would have cost literally nothing for the place where I was campaigning for it to be introduced. Like, it was, most people were over it. It was just a specific group of people, and the campaign went on for years and years and years, but we finally managed to convince the management to introduce a living wage. And I think, you know, it was standing in the cold, you know, trying to get people's attention, doing different things, doing different campaign tactics like sending letters, emails, you name it, we tried it. But I think you can eventually, you know, it's just about persistence and being there and making sure that they know you're not going to back down and you're still going to be there, I'd say.
Thank you.
And power to you, obviously.
Thank you, Siobhan, for that question. And I know I would like to introduce you as well. That's Siobhan Sliman. She was raised the question as also the women's officer in the Saffron Walden CLP, and she's also going to talk as a panel member on pensions soon. Are there other hands that's coming up or other questions? Not that I can see.
I think Sam has a hand up.
Oh, who?
Sam Knight.
Okay, Samantha, would you like to?
Andrew, I'm with Andrew. So if you put Andrew's...
please do.
Okay, hello, Olivia. Thank you very much. I wondered, you said that you were deputy leader of a council. What can we do on a local level to campaign for women? What are the things that we should be asking for? And what did you do when you tried to help women in your position? Because we're leading into a campaign now for the local elections. So what can you tell us that we have the power to do on a local level?
Well, I guess it's a bit different up where I am, because we're the Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire, as we're nicknamed. So we've got a Labour Council that's been quite well established, and probably has a bit of a better starting point on some of these issues, but not all. So one thing that our council is doing going into this election is actually raising care workers' pay above and beyond what the government is, which is zero. So we're doing that to really put in place and empower women, and that's a really powerful thing. We obviously had the centenary, and we recognised women, and we got a gorgeous piece of art done to celebrate women within the city. So we've got a statue of women, and I know this is all like signalling, but I think it's really important that women, young girls in our city have people to look up to. So we have the amazing Women of Steel statue in our city centre that people can kind of see and kind of understand the history of women in our movement. We had basically the centenary of suffragettes and that movement, and actually Sheffield, weirdly, is one of the places where the suffrage movement kind of began. So we managed to get a plaque and that on the agenda. We have a women's hub where we invite women's voices and the community, and that's led by a charity but funded by the council, to bring women together around different issues and inform policy choices as well. So that's quite a powerful tool, because it allows that layer of kind of independent scrutiny of all the decisions we were making. I did a lot of equality impact assessments of every budget cut. Unfortunately, it was kind of inevitable that they were always going to fall hardest on women, but by always asking those questions and seeing if there was a way to mitigate those issues, it really meant that we could shape and try and avoid some of the worst impacts of the cuts, which we've had many in the city. So I think it's about empowerment. It's about making sure that women are in the room when decisions are being made. That's so important, because a lot of things don't get discussed unless women are there. And also just recognizing that the values of equality, all the Labour Party values that we hold so dear, are really important for women. And actually, I think you will do much better convincing women to vote for you if you stick to those principles and talk about them in your policies. So under me, we became a living wage employer. I also brought in an ethical procurement policy, which really put thought and effort into social value, that they call it, and making sure that every pound we were spending in Sheffield was having a positive impact. And clearly that was also about gender as much as anything else. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, I mean, as you said, campaigns in one part of the country will vary from another part of the country depending on the ecosystem there, I believe. And that's something that we're trying to create here as well through a local women's forum, which again, now the chances of it becoming into a women's branch, and now, also encouraging this kind of local campaigns that we did through a petition that we are going to close today and celebrate, that is specifically related to period poverty, which again, at the policy level, there was some significant changes, but it ties up a lot with the issue of dignity, that we will also, period poverty to period dignity is the big shift, and how that connects with global concepts and global movements and discriminations and taboos that come with it. So this is also something that we want to, keep up, that local campaigns can also bring in international stories, which is something that, ties up with the question of media, perhaps encouraging the media to collate these kind of local stories with international stories and bring out issues more generally that has structural problems. I think the whole issue of empowerment is tied with structural inequalities, that is not something just about bringing more women into the labor market, but ensuring that empowerment strategies are also in place. And that ties up again with a lot of the issues and points that you raised, but specifically we're running very short of time now. But I want to wrap up by saying that, climate change is a big issue, green jobs, as you mentioned. So how can we pressurize more kind of gender sensitive procurement in the green job sector? Because I think this will become the next big challenge in the COVID reconstruction. So if there's anything you want to add to already what you've said,
I mean, I think that's a really important point, and I think that one thing I would kind of say, I should also say that since becoming an MP, I have led a campaign on maternity services around the pandemic as well. So that's another campaign not related to the council, but something that I've done specifically around women. Because unfortunately I had a miscarriage, but I was already campaigning on it, and it was all a bit chaotic, and different places were doing different things, so we managed to get the guidance changed in December. But on that point, I think that it's really important, and I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that we're not just facing a climate crisis, we're also facing one of biodiversity as well. And at the moment, the conservation kind of jobs that we need to see, and this is particularly important to my area because I've got the Peak District on my doorstep, and a lot of a fair chunk of the Peak District actually comes into my constituency. But we need to make sure that we're seeing Black and minority and ethnic people getting those jobs and new jobs, and women are getting those jobs and new jobs. Obviously, as a scientist, I think it's really important that we promote and keep women within that sector. I know so many people who are the brightest, who have gone on, done PhDs, got to the end of that, done 6-month contracts in science, which is just unsustainable for a lot of people, and I think unfortunately benefits men ahead of women, and that kind of plays out that it doesn't matter how many you have going in at entry level, the rate and retention of women scientists is really, really important, and more efforts need to go in there to make sure women are able to stay in those research jobs, so that we're able to get the best people doing the groundwork and achieving some of the breakthroughs that we need to achieve as well. So they're two areas that I think could be an important way of making sure that we're protecting those equalities in that transition that we need to see.
Yeah, and also just want to highlight this for everyone here that one of the things that I had in mind when I brought this topic out on equality and empowerment, bringing in empowerment as well in the theme, is to sort of tie in with the UN resolution of really raising the voice of women in the science sector, which we know that there are huge disparities there. Where is the women's voice in intergovernmental climate change planning? That's right at the top of policy level. But even for the grassroots, I mean, you're probably aware, and this ties up very well with the International Women's Day, when we can look at the kind of challenges that grassroots activists in the global south have to face, being a woman in conservation, for instance, whether it's forest dwellers or forest climate change practices, poverty levels, and those kind of things, and the kind of abuse that women activists have to face as well in the social media for their activism is another kind of story. So yeah, I mean, with all this, I feel that climate change, women's role calls for a different kind of session, and perhaps we would like to have you back at some point to elaborate and talk, especially you being in the science sector, that ties up with what we're trying to do here, regionally, locally. Cambridge is very close by, it's a science hub. So that ties up well with the different asymmetries that we see. Stuart is here. Stuart, did you want to add anything, since you've been extremely helpful in getting our speakers, and thank you again for that. Is there anything you want to say, Stuart, at this point?
Well, I apologise to Olivia for having to miss most of your talk. I'm sorry about that, but children needed to be taught. No, it's just I suppose just that sort of the angle of you coming from sort of scientific research, and just you know, what I suppose really is just really ensuring that, you know, we don't have those sort of glass ceilings, that we get more and more sort of equality through the system. That all too often it seems to be that men can seem to float to the top, you know, and get all the acknowledgements. You can even see it in things like Nobel Prizes over the years, where women have maybe been an absolutely essential part of the process of getting that, but it's been the men who've been rewarded. You know, so I suppose that's really just something that I'd like to, you know.
I think that calls for another session, because it's too vast to look at professional sectors and how women are doing in certain sectors, whether it's in corporate, private, you know, science sectors. Yeah, I mean, Olivia, did you want to say anything at this point?
I think it's
really, to wrap up as well.
I think it's important that, you know, yeah, there is glass ceilings, but there's also net floors. So, you know, people are literally walking a tightrope to keep in the industries, and that's part of the issue as well. And, you know, a lot of people, you know, fair enough if you want to diversify what you're doing, but that kind of bench level work and research is absolutely key to our industrial strategy and where we want to go in the UK. And I think excluding a group of people based on gender, which is what we're kind of seeing, is not good enough, and people are falling down and not being we're not getting the best out of our researchers because of that.
Thank you very much. We hope to see you for another session, and please stay as long as you like and continue with the discussion if you're still there for the next speakers that we have.
Thank you. I'm really sorry. I do have to go because I've got another event that I need to get to. But thank you so much for the invitation and allowing me.
Thank you so much again for your talk. Thank you. Bye. So our next speakers will look at the impact of the pandemic on mental health and women's role, because as we all know that, you know, this mental health thing is something that I wanted to keep for this session, looking at it is kind of being talked of as if that is the second wave of impact in terms of how it's affected women particularly. So we have Paula Meriez and Anna Bell from NHS Cambridge. Paula is a mental health nurse, and she is dual trained, qualified in physical health as well as mental health. And during her career, she has worked in Trinidad, the United States, and England. Anna Bell is a mental health practitioner in Cambridge South City, primary care mental health service. And she's also studied social work in Anglia Ruskin University after having children. So both Paula and Anna will talk about women's role in the pandemic, covering a range of sort of sectors. I hope we will see and hear on home responsibilities to social services and professions, and the potential impact on the mental health as well. Can I ask you to share your screen?
Yes, I'm just going to try. I'm not very, I will see how this goes. Hopefully it will work. Right. Oh. There we go. Can you see that?
Yeah, if you do you want, yeah, that's fine.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can't see anybody now, but hopefully you can see my screen. So I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Anna, I'm a mental health social worker, and as a social worker, I've always worked in adult mental health for the NHS, either in the community or currently in primary care. I just let my colleague Paula introduce herself, and then I'll talk more obviously about the topic, which is women, mental health and the pandemic.
Thank you. So, as As Sanjukta said, I'm Paula and I am a mental health nurse, nurse by background with several years, and I'm currently one of the clinical leads for the primary care services in Cambridge. So we both work for the NHS CPFT, which is Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Foundation Trust. Anna is going to run through some of the presentation, and then we'll take any questions towards the end.
Lovely, thanks Paula. So I was just going to cover really sort of the pandemic and gender specifically, so sort of drawing on what Olivia was talking about, and then some sort of statistics regarding women's mental health, then a little bit about the impact on mental health services with the pandemic. Paula was going to cover a little bit on international mental health, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. So I was just thinking about the occupation and the pandemic, and as Olivia talked about, if you think about the front line and the disproportionately impact on women, you've got healthcare professionals, you know, it's not an exhaustive list, but schools and nursery care workers, retail staff, social care, and I put construction because that was probably the only one that is predominantly men. But just for some statistics, in 2019, 75.8% of school teachers in the UK were women. 9 out of 10 nurses in the UK are women. In 2017, 85% of children and family social workers were female. The UK government statistics show that a staggering 84% of carers in England are women, and again, as Olivia said, in retail, predominantly women as well. So the impacts, obviously, with the, you know, being on the front line and all of the risks and emotionally how that's going to have affected people is disproportionately probably affecting women. Also, according to the Independent newspaper, a recent report found that women are more likely to deal with the homeschooling, childcare and chores around the house, even if they're juggling this with work at the same time. So that was another you know, thing that's disproportionately affecting women. Maternity services, pregnancy and childbirth. I think anecdotally, I haven't got statistics on that, but I think I've seen definitely an increase in women that are either pregnant or recently had children, because obviously it's such a difficult time anyway, transitional time in our lives, but you know, the limited social contacts, family support networks, face-to-face appointments with health visitors, having people present at appointments, I think that's definitely having an adverse effect on well-being. The police have reported an increase in domestic violence. Obviously that does affect men, but it's still predominantly women that are victims of domestic violence. And they're receiving increased calls from third parties, so perhaps because people at home during lockdown, they're reporting more instances to the police as well. So really just to, as Olivia was saying, just to evidence, I guess, that women are being disproportionately affected. And in terms of trends in women's mental health in the UK, 1 in 6 adults has a common mental health disorder. This was in 2016, but that would be 1 in 5 women compared with 1 in 8 men. And overall, the rate's largely stable in men, but there's a steady increase in women, and young women are especially at high risk. 1 in 5 16 to 25-year-old women report recent self-harm, and suicide rates in women are at their highest for a decade. Women between the ages of 16 and 24 are almost 3 times as likely to experience a common mental health issue as males of the same age, and 24% of women and 13% of men in England are diagnosed with depression in their lifetime. Major depression is more common in females than males, and women are twice as likely to be diagnosed with anxiety. So with the pandemic then and the impact on mental health, wellbeing and mental health services, you know, there's a likelihood that we're going to see an increase in things like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, potentially drug and alcohol problems, postnatal depression, and sadly bereavement from people that have lost loved ones. So I was thinking about sort of mental health services and how they've responded to the pandemic, and the way that we've worked has had to change quite quickly. video conferencing, for example, rather than face-to-face appointments. So people, I think it's important to note as well that mental health services have stayed open, and people can still access help if they're struggling with their mental health. But we have had to adapt how we're working. So the video conferencing has been one of those things. And I think people could see that as a negative thing, but actually, in my experience, it's been quite positive as well, because it's meant that people have had sometimes people don't attend appointments if they're struggling with anxiety. So for some people, it's actually been easier to be able to remain at home. Also, if they've got childcare or work commitments, it's given them a bit more flexibility. If they've got physical disability or financial implications of attending appointments. So for some people, it's been a real benefit. And hopefully, as we move out of the pandemic, it's going to give people choice. To be able to have a face-to-face appointment or other technology to see people more quickly as well. And also, if people miss appointments, you need a physical space to see people prior to the pandemic, whereas now you can be much more flexible about offering another appointment if people weren't able to attend for some reason. I think there's also been a huge national response, obviously, to the pandemic, which has been, fantastic with NHS have created mental health services for staff that have been affected by their work within the pandemic, if they're perhaps struggling with post-traumatic stress or other psychological distress from having been on the front line. Charities have had a fantastic response and do fantastic work with mental health as well, in supporting people practically and emotionally, and local authorities as well have been contacting vulnerable people with practical support and emotional support. But that's not to dismiss the impacts, obviously, on the social isolation that people are experiencing. So thinking about how that translates into mental health services, then I just wonder if we're seeing the true numbers of people yet coming through, or are people worried about burdening their GPs at the moment? So perhaps we'll get an increase in referrals. I think it's also important to note that for some people, the lockdown itself, again anecdotally, but a lot of people have been saying that period's been easier for some reason, because the real stresses of everyday life, getting places, putting petrol in the car, paying for childcare costs, and things like that perhaps have been less. And maybe once we come out of lockdown, for some people there'll be more anxiety, and obviously for other people lockdown's been so difficult because of the isolation and not being able to see loved ones. It's it's sort of, I've been getting a real mixed picture for people as well. There's still people receiving furlough, so I don't know if we've seen the true effect on mental health with the economic difficulties that people are facing yet, and it might take time to get the real sort of the people that are struggling psychologically. That might not become apparent until we're returning to normal life for some people as well. I think accessing diagnosis and medication can be quite straightforward, but obviously psychological interventions, they're a finite resource. So that's something I think we need to think about in terms of planning for the impact of the pandemic on the future. And I just there's some fantastic research I just want to talk about very quickly from mental health in the pandemic, led by the Mental Health Foundation, and that's shown that people's mental health is being affected by social distancing measures and their economic consequences, and furthermore, mental health effects are falling unequally across society, with people in some social groups bearing more of the mental health burden than others. And they were talking very much about prevention, and I've put the link at the bottom of that slide for people to have a look at. And it says, although some mental health problems are partially influenced by genetics, genes play a much smaller role in shaping our mental health than our social and economic circumstances. In almost all cases, our genes do nothing more than carry a slight risk. What is more important is to look at the wide range of social, economic, family, and emotional factors that interact with our genes and our biology. These factors can make us more or less likely to develop a mental health problem, and there is strong and accumulating evidence that social inequalities such as poverty and income inequality, gender, and a variety of minority statuses and adverse childhood experiences and trauma increase the risk of mental health problems. It is therefore logical that reducing these inequalities could prevent mental health problems. And I just wanted to, before I finish, just talk about, I put some statistics on suicide there, and there's been an awful lot shared in social media about suicide rates increasing during the pandemic, and I thought I'd do some research on that, and actually Samaritans and Manchester University, just after the first lockdown, did say that at early look, and obviously it is difficult to tell because of the numbers, it hadn't looked like there'd been an increase in suicide at that time. Obviously, you know, we need to be cautious about that because we're further down the line now, but it is encouraging, and I think it's just important to note that at that time there hadn't been a big increase. However, suicide rates do tend to increase, sadly, with recession. So, you know, it's something we need to be mindful of. And I have just put a slide on there for anybody that's interested about everybody having conversations with people or loved ones if they're worried about them. Again, from the Mental Health Foundation, they use the acronym WAIT. So it's just saying that prevention is something that we can all individually help with, and a short conversation with another person can sometimes be enough to make the difference between life and death for them. And the advice WAIT is a good way to remember how you can support somebody. So the W is for watch out for signs of distress and uncharacteristic behaviours such as social withdrawal, excessive quietness, irritability, uncharacteristic outbursts, or talking about death or suicide. And ask, are you having suicidal thoughts? And asking about suicide does not encourage it, and nor does it lead to a person thinking about it, but it might help prevent it, and it can be a potentially life-saving conversation. And the last thing is the T for talk to others, to encourage loved ones to seek help from their GP or healthcare professionals. And I have put some resources at the end of the slide for people if they need to be able to seek help. And I'm going to hand over, sorry, I've talked rather a lot there, but I'm going to hand over to Paula now, and then we'll take any questions.
Mental health internationally would, you know, particularly of women, it would be very similar to what's happening in the UK, because the pandemic is worldwide and it's affecting people throughout. Different countries obviously would respond differently, and their previous provisions of mental health services are different from what the UK would be. We have seen in developing countries that their mental health services are not as developed as in the first world countries, and the availability of psychological resources, even certain medications and other treatment pathways are not as developed as in the United States or Europe. As we can see, I have worked in developing countries, and I can testify that this is the case. The treatment there is for bare minimum, and there are only limited treatment that is directed towards serious mental illnesses, for instance, the schizophrenias and the bipolars, as opposed to common mental health disorders that we see are very, very rampant in any society. So if you compare what the responses would be in developing world to mental health, it would be far less than what we would get in first world countries. So we are very fortunate in this country, and you know, first world countries where the responses are people are aware, they are the symptoms and the impact of the pandemic is being recognized, and treatment hopefully would be put in place for managing the mental health in the future. So as much as I can say is that we're hoping, and as Anna alluded to, that it is being recognized that the pandemic is going to have severe impact on the mental health of everyone, particularly women who are at the forefront of the care and responsibilities. And we're hoping that services would respond in a manner that is going to meet the need. It is early days yet, because we haven't seen that increase in funding for the mental health services, but we're sure the demand is going to be coming. Anna's put up some resources there for mental health, and I mean, in your county it would be probably different from what is available for Cambridgeshire, but these are some of the general resources that are available. The first line for any common mental health issues would be the wellbeing service. Some places it's referred to as the IAPT service, and most counties now, I know, those are self-referral services. In addition to that, there are lots of self-help information that is coming out on the county council, the city councils, as well as the NHS website. So, you know, not all mental health struggles would need referral into secondary mental health services, but they can be, the first line treatment be managed within primary care. And I think Essex is now beginning to set up their primary care mental health services, whereas Cambridgeshire is more established, where people can be treated within their GP surgeries in primary care. So that's all we have to say. We are quite happy to take questions at the moment.
Yeah, we have roughly 8 minutes for questions. If there's anything that anyone wants to comment or they want to share their own experience during the pandemic with their friends and families, of course, keeping data anonymous, that's something I would stress on because otherwise I think we could have, you know, delved into some kind of storytelling as a methodology for exposing mental well-being, but we have to, you know, resist those temptations because we have to also look at data regulations here. But if there's any response to the points raised so far, then that would be great. If anyone wants to say anything at this point.
I do apologise as well because I realised I had my camera off, but I'm back.
I mean, you could have kept the video on when the slides were being shown, but that's okay. Jane, I think Jane raised her hand. Jane Sharp, would you like to?
I was just wondering, in terms of process, if somebody has a mental health problem, how long does it take once they're referred by their GP or whoever for them to actually receive treatment?
Well, I think it depends probably very much on each local authorities differently, but within our services really quite quickly. So what I don't know what the average wait time is, Paula, do you know?
So,
I mean, it depends.
This is what we was talking about in terms of primary care mental health services, which is quite established in Cambridge, and Anne and myself work as part of that within Cambridgeshire at the moment, because we have the flexibility of the video conference and clients are being seen within 1 week. We are triaging and processing referral within 24 hours. And we also have a crisis line, which is manned by professional mental health clinicians, and that's available 24/7. And you just have to dial the 111, select the option 2. It's called the Vanguard service that Cambridgeshire was one of the pilot projects, which we started a few years ago, but has continued. And that is really an excellent service. People don't even have to go to the GP to access that. They just phone and access if they needed it in a crisis.
And Pamela had her hand up.
Yeah, please. I can't always see the hands up for some reason. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, thank you. I manage the Open Door Counselling Service for Uttlesford, which is a free service for 11 to 26-year-olds. So I'm aware of what is happening in Essex, and it is absolutely appalling. Young people are waiting 3 to 6 months to see somebody in the wellbeing service. And what's happening is the wellbeing service is referring to us. We're a non-profit making organisation and get no funding from the NHS. But we are taking the cases that the wellbeing service can't cope with. So in Essex, I think it's a pretty serious and appalling situation for mental health. And this morning on the television, there was a young girl of about 15. There was a programme, I think it's BBC News, about young people and mental health. And she was talking about how she'd been suicidal. She was in tears on the television. And she'd gone to her GP. Her GP had referred her to CAMHS, and CAMHS had said she wasn't serious enough to be dealt with by them. So her father had to pay for private counselling. And we're finding that a lot within our service, that they're being told they're not serious enough for the NHS mental health service to deal with. I wonder, so it's interesting that you put a different slant on it from Cambridgeshire.
It is sad, and as Anna showed on the statistics, those were national statistics, there has been that increase of younger people with mental health needs, particularly in young girls, and that's the national statistics and a national trend that we see. And I know the last NHS long-term plan, the plan was to invest a lot more into children's mental health services, and certainly we can see that being started within Cambridge. I can't speak for Essex because I work in Cambridgeshire, and we can see that the children's services are currently being beefed up. Also, what is happening, what we see is a lot of resources being put within primary care itself. It's an effort to destigmatize mental health. So you would find that Mind has been given a lot of money, as well as third sector organization to provide those counseling services, and it is a way of destigmatizing and also challenging the most severe to the secondary care services, and having the common mental health the illnesses being treated within primary care.
Yeah, I think there's a comment from Pam on the chat. In our service, young men are approaching us just as much as young women. But I think in your presentation, you also showed, how women are being affected, and the number of cases have gone up due to obviously rise in domestic violence, and those kind of issues particularly relate to the context of the pandemic. I think there's also reports that are emerging clearly saying that BAME communities have been affected more by mental health issues than the resident white communities here. And that's kind of a worldwide sort of pattern that's emerging. And that probably has got to do with, at least for the UK, I can say, having worked in the universities, international students are very much coming to, with their problems, as well as the fact that they cannot go back home. And that is expanding the definition of mental health within the university care sector, counseling sector, to incorporating mental well-being. So you're aware of, the differences that are now being played out as to what is clinically diagnosed depression to the larger context of mental well-being, which is becoming quite important again for the pandemic context, because I think you showed on your slides a bereavement factor, which is a very big factor here, isolation, social isolation in communities which are very used to staying very close by. That's another thing with BAME communities, that the support system and the support network of BAME community members are very different, where in London, for instance, there are reports that people stay closer together. And I think you can see these patterns in Cambridge as well. A large section of BAME population is there in Cambridge North, as well as Cambridge, and international students, of course, is very much there.
Sanjukta, I see Sandy has her hand up.
Who?
Sandy.
Sandy. Okay, Sandy, would you like to say anything at this point?
Yes, I'm having at the moment CBT from Essex every week on its Zoom, and it is absolutely amazing. And I just feel that it should be offered to everybody in lockdown, because we all need it, really. It did take, from referral, initially it took, you have like an initial conversation, and then it goes very quiet, and then they contact me again in 3 months. And then I had that was about 2 years ago, and then I'm having it again now. And they wanted to give me to a different girl that I didn't know anything about me. So I then had to wait. In order to get the same person, I had to wait 4 months. And it's working really well, but no, it's just, it takes a long time. And if you are a child who's suicidal, you are more likely to, well, I've had, one of my foster children was suicidal. And I remember we were told to ring the crisis team in Chelmsford, and the crisis team were very good. They spoke to us for about an hour, and then they said, by the sound what you're saying, Sandy, you need to have 2 social workers there. This was at the weekend. I said, oh, thank goodness. I said, when will they be round? And they said, oh, we don't have 2 social workers. So it was like the crisis team was worse than nothing. It was, but I would say yes to mental health.
Yeah.
Also, the other thing, I've also started to be a mentor for children for Kids Inspire, and there's in our area there's 70% more children being referred to that because of COVID. So it's a tsunami of emotions.
Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you for sharing that, Sandy. Indeed, it kind of adds a lot of value to the session, as well as I'm glad that Paula and Anna, that you came here and you shared your experience of, as we say, the tsunami of emotions and mental health. There's a lot more we can do, perhaps build some kind of local campaign or to support what is going on, and bring out the disparities between services in Essex and Cambridge. I mean, these are large issues again to deal with, but I'm glad that a lot of things are coming up here that will be a spillover conversation for something else that we can have as well. So thank you very much again to join us.
Can I ask a question, one more?
We really, we have to keep to time. We've already exceeded, but if it's a very brief one, then just for a minute.
Paula, you mentioned a service called, is it Vanguard, that's available by ringing 111?
Yes, that's the Cambridgeshire service.
There's a Cambridge service.
And selecting option 2. I think 20 sites within the country was first selected to provide that service. But I think coming on to the next phase, hopefully the government will invest into that service, because it is a crisis service and it's available at a crisis level. But I mean, just one final thing, we do know that mental health services is underfunded. There's a huge demand and the funding does not add up to the demand. And even though we respond, because we've been fortunate to have Vanguard in Cambridge, other services treatment wise, there are waiting lists for treatment. There are gaps in our service that we don't have to provide for trauma focused therapy and for immediate responses in certain places. So mental health is indeed underfunded. It's always been the Cinderella services, but this is a huge great need. And if in your campaign for that more funding, it would be a blessing to us as clinicians when we have to say no to somebody that we don't have anything for you, or when we say you have to wait for it.
Thank you very much. Again, this is a useful session because we haven't actually outlined what exactly would be the campaign, but the idea was to bring ideas together from this session and then collect those very bullet points of the various campaigns that we are thinking of. And we will keep in touch with whatever developments happen here. And please do stay for the session as long as you like, and join the discussion as well. So thank you again.
Thank you
for having us.
And, thank you very much for your contributions. Our next speaker, I'd like to welcome Anna Smith to talk on impact of COVID, again, on women, a broad spectrum of ideas I'm expecting as well. So welcome on board Councillor Anna Smith, who is the Deputy Leader and Statutory, as well as the Executive Councillor for Communities in Cambridge Labour. So welcome again, Voice from Cambridge, and thank you again for joining us.
Hi there, and can I just check you can hear me because I've got earpods on. I want to make sure. I'm getting some nods, great.
We can. Thank you again for joining us.
So what I was thinking of speaking about today, but I'm really happy to speak about something different if that would be helpful, was tiny bit about the women who have inspired me, and then a little bit about what we're doing in Cambridge, particularly around the COVID crisis, and a bit more broadly about what it means to be a woman councillor. And as you said, to kind of talk about where women have been particularly hit by COVID, because it has been, I think, a particular problem in many ways for women. So first of all, again, my name's Anna Smith. It's really nice, although I'm from Cambridge, my dad's family are actually all from around Dunmow. So this is really nice to be able to come and talk to this CLP particularly, because this is an area, my parents still live in Stortford, it's where I grew up, so spent a lot of time coming into this CLP for all sorts of things, and so it's really nice to be able to talk. And I should say at the start, if there's anything that I or we from Cambridge can do to support you as you build your campaign, then really, really happy to talk about that as well. So I wanted to start by talking about a couple of women that have massively inspired me. And I wanted to name check a woman that is the main reason I trained as a teacher, and one of the main reasons that I became a socialist, which is a woman called Kitty Higdon, who some of you may have heard about. She was the lead teacher at a school in Norfolk in Burston, and her husband, Tom, who was her assistant, and her were fighters for social justice. They wanted a properly funded school. They wanted a school where the children weren't taught to defer to the local elites. They were sacked. And the children went on strike, and they were supported by their parents, and it became the longest strike in British history. And she's one of the main reasons that I got involved in politics, because she fought for her community and for the most vulnerable people in that community. And I'm actually quite proud to say my great aunt was a teacher locally, and before the war she was a teacher at Chesterford School, and she equally stopped her children in her school bowing and curtsying to the local lord of the manor. She came in and said, I'm that's not happening. So I'm quite proud that she did that. And we're also really, really lucky in Cambridge, because in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and running through the 20th century, we had a lot of amazing local women who have been forgotten but are now being remembered. So a woman called Leah Manning, who was a pioneering teacher and worked in the toughest part of Cambridge where there was huge social deprivation, who ended up evacuating 4,000 Basque refugee children out of Spain in the 1930s. Clara Rackham, who was a councillor in the same ward that I'm in, who fought for votes for women, but also for factory reform and for prison reform, and Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who was a leading campaigner on women's rights and who lived in Cambridge. And there was a blue plaque on her house, and it was to her husband, who was in his own right famous, but all it said was, lived here with his wife and children. No mention at all of this amazing woman. So one of the things we've done is we've made sure there are now blue plaques to all three of those amazing women, kind of reflecting what they can do. Now, only about 35% of local councillors are women, so I hope there may be some people on this call who are thinking of changing that. In Cambridge, we're quite lucky. Our council is almost, our Labour group is almost gender balanced. Our executive has more women than men. That didn't stop when I got married 2 years ago, everybody asking me if I was planning to stand down as a councillor, because I'd got married, despite the fact that my husband is also a councillor, and nobody, not one person, asked him the same question. So there is still a way to go. Literally, I had people, I could see a couple of shocked faces. This was 2 years ago, and people literally thinking I would want to stand down because I had got married, which is quite shocking. But even though there's a lot of sexism, and I'd also want to mention the inequality for women as councillors is huge. So 35% of councillors across the country are women. But I would want to mention that only 4% of councillors across the country are from a Black or minority ethnic background. So we've got a lot to do on women's rights, but if we think about that in the wider context of rights in general, there is so much to do. And I think it's really important to remember that on International Women's Day, that we stand in solidarity with people who are also marginalised. So as a council, we've tried to do what we can, and this is where it is really exciting to be part of a council where Labour is in control of Cambridge City. We're only a district, so we don't get the control largely over health or over schooling and those areas. That's county and that's Tory. So that's a completely different story. But we do get to shape quite a bit, and that is just an amazing privilege. And that includes a lot that we've done over the last few years, but it also includes things that we've tried to work on over the last year in terms of the pandemic response. Now, that has been the most astonishing effort of a whole community. We've had mutual aid groups, local churches, local mosques, charities, voluntary groups working together to support our city. What is nice when you are the council is that you can actually do something to support that. And so we've put in quite a large structure to support that, but also a lot of money to support that. Every year we have around about £1 million of community grants that we give out to support groups that are supporting the most vulnerable, supporting equality, supporting anti-poverty work. And most of the grants this year have gone towards COVID relief. We've got a system of food hubs across the city. And those hubs, which were set up at the start of the pandemic last year, have given out 214 tonnes of food and have had over 31,000 visits since it started. And what's really clear from that is how much women are facing a lot of the bulk of the problems through COVID. Now, I don't want to say it's only women, because of course it isn't. And what we've seen in general is that there is a problem for people who have been perhaps in gig economy jobs, people who have worked in hospitality. Those areas particularly have been struck very hard. And the uncertainty around the furlough scheme has been a particular problem, because a lot of people who might have been kept on furlough have faced redundancy because their employers didn't know it was carrying on. So we've seen roughly a doubling of people on universal credit in Cambridge since this started. And that's only the people we know about, because we don't get complete figures. We can only kind of work it out from various information sources. So it's hitting the most vulnerable the hardest. And then you get that crossing with it's hitting the most vulnerable women even harder. So what we find is it's often, and we hear this time and time again, it's often the women who are facing the bulk of the childcare. So with the children being at home, and the women, if they're lucky, being able to work from home as well, but often not, are the ones that are having to make the sacrifices, potentially the ones that are having to give up their jobs, potentially the ones that are really juggling all of it at once. So we're finding there's been anecdotally, but we're finding there's been a disproportionate impact on the women through this, that they are the ones who are more likely to have struggled, to have lost their work through this time. And we've also got a lot of women who are bringing up kids alone, and that has become particularly tricky in this period too. So again, we have lots of different types of families. We have a lot of single dads as well, but we know we do have a lot of mums who are really working to support their family at this time. And through our food hubs, we're getting a lot of calls for support in different ways. And one of the things we're hearing again and again is the mum who is trying to find food for her family and then is hit by the constant failure of the Tories to provide free school meals in the holidays. And it's been disgusting because it's happened, it's a third time now this has happened. And there was a promise last time that this wouldn't happen again. And what happened as soon as the kids were off on, were back at home, these horrible parcels. And we had, you know, food parcels that wouldn't last for 2 days being given out as if they were going to last for the whole week. So we had a massive upsurge of people turning up at our food hubs in tears because they didn't have enough and going away so happy because they were able to walk away with fresh food and staples and all sorts of things. And our food hub model, by the way, is a free model. So we've got food hubs and we've obviously got the food banks, but the food hubs, anyone can turn up and we don't ask questions. You come and you take what you need. And we've got 8 of those hubs across the city that are run by volunteers. I have to say, a lot of those volunteers happen to also be Labour people, but that's not why they're, you know, there seems to be a bit of a Venn diagram there, but it's a whole community effort. So we've had people struggling to get food, and then you add that, the digital expectations as well. So people that perhaps could have gone to the local library or borrowed a neighbour's computer, suddenly they can't do that. And often we're finding it might be a family where the one bit of internet access is a phone, a pay-as-you-go phone with limited data. And then suddenly everything is being done on that, and that includes the kids' schoolwork. So there's been a real issue there too. And one of the things that we have tried to do is to get computers and data out to people. Now, that's not all families. Some of that has been older people as well, but that's been something we've been really pushing at. And again, we've been working with the community, funding some schemes, trying to get information out. But it's just been really clear that women have suffered disproportionately over this period. So this is something we really want to think about as we move out of this. But it's all within that bigger context of it's the most vulnerable being hit by COVID measures the most. And that is clear time and time again. I'm very lucky. I work in an office. I've been working from home since last March. It's possible to do. I've got a laptop right here. I've got decent internet. That hasn't been the experience for so many people in our city. And COVID has really exacerbated the poverty. It's made it so much worse. But what I would want to finish on is saying that it hasn't created it. And the problems of universal credit, the problems of well over a decade of Tory austerity, the problems of the bedroom tax, the problems of year after year after year council funding being cut and cut and cut and cut. We have no core grant whatsoever at Cambridge City Council now at all. You know, every year our funding goes down. Those things aren't going to go away at the end of the COVID crisis. So one of the things I think we're particularly aware of, that there isn't a vaccine for poverty and inequality. So we're going to have to keep pushing with our anti-poverty work and the work to try and build our community up again. And I'm really happy to talk any of that. If it's of interest to you, what we're doing to challenge poverty and inequality in the city or to make things more sustainable, just fire away. I'm very happy to take any questions I can. I did just want to finish with one thing, which is it's been such an amazing privilege to be part of Cambridge City Council. I don't come from a political background at all. My dad was an electrician, and even when I was at university, I didn't get involved in student politics because I thought it wasn't for people like me, it was for the posh kids, basically. I would never have become a city councillor if somebody hadn't asked me to stand. If someone hadn't specifically said, have you thought of standing? And I was completely blown away because I would never have assumed that it was something that I could think about doing. So what I would say, and I'm sure this is something that people say all the time, but if you're a woman and you think you might be interested in getting involved in local politics, just do it. Just put yourself forward. And if you know a woman who you think should get involved in local politics, don't assume she thinks so too. Ask her. And I would just put that as a plea, because I've had the most amazing privilege to be part of supporting a city through a pandemic. And if one person hadn't come up to me and said, have you thought about being a city councillor? I'd never have done it. So if there's someone here today where that resonates with you, please go for it. But I'm going to stop there. But if you've got any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Councillor Anna Smith, for sharing with us all your experiences and, a very inspirational talk as well, encouraging women to participate more in politics. I think that's a great idea, with local campaigns and hubs and more community participation that you touched on. Can we have questions now, please? If there's anybody who wants to intervene and even make a statement or have anything to share. Samantha, thank you. Do you want to?
Yes, hi Anna, thanks. So we have poverty as well in Saffron Walden and in the district we're in, which is called Uttlesford. It's a really affluent area generally, but of course we have key workers who are on low pay and other people who just don't have jobs because COVID has caused them to lose their jobs. So we have increasing levels of poverty and people living on universal credit, but it's not something that's very much in the public mind, because you always think Saffron Walden's a great place to live and it's like the idyllic sort of rural area where people don't imagine that happens. So I'd be really interested to hear about how you can help with poverty, because when people lose their jobs and go on universal credit, they have to really adjust their lifestyle if that's possible, or they have to to manage, and the universal credit payments don't cover the rent generally, because our area has really high rent costs or housing costs, and you only get your mortgage interest payments met if you're on universal credit. So all these things cause a crisis of poverty where the money coming in just doesn't cover your bills. And for a household, that's important. We know that for an economy, it's not quite that simple, but for a household, that is an impossible situation to have as an ongoing situation. And there will presumably be evictions eventually. Some people are being made homeless in Saffron Walden as well, and they end up living in terrible accommodation, like converted office blocks, and still suffering the poverty and the ill health consequences as well of living in those environments. So I'd be really interested in hearing about your anti-poverty measures and what can be done on a local level. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall I go for that one first? Because I think that will be...
Sure. Yeah,
I mean, that's a very similar experience to Cambridge. So when people talk about Cambridge, they think, oh yeah, dreaming spires, affluent, beautiful houses, isn't it lovely, isn't it wealthy? And we are the most unequal city in the country, statistically, because we've got some really high earners, and particularly around, say, at the science parks. And then we've got a lot of deprivation. We've got a lot of parts of Cambridge that it's what you're saying. It's not the kind of thing you visualize when you think Cambridge. You think it's all terribly privileged and affluent, and it really isn't. And I was a deputy head at one of the comprehensives in Cambridge for several years. And I can tell you that not all the children walking through that door were affluent and well off. In terms of what we can do as a council, so I'll talk a bit about some of the things the council has done, appreciating that you don't have a Labour council. I'll also talk a bit about some of the things the community's done as well, which might be useful. From a council point of view, one of the first things we did, we came to power in 2014, and one of the first things we did was put in place an anti-poverty strategy with money attached. And we've now just launched our third version of that. What we do is we've got this fabulous, completely amazing officer who will research the up-to-date anti-poverty statistics and talk to the community as well. So we can keep changing the targets. So every couple of years we change our key targets for the anti-poverty strategy, so we can work out where the areas of Cambridge are that need the most help and what kind of themes are that need the most help within that. Linked to that, we have various council officers who support that. So we have a living wage officer. We think we're the only council in the country that's got that. And one of her jobs is to approach employers and persuade them of the benefits of becoming a real living wage employer. And we've got about 50 employers that are formally signed up, including, and this is like, we're so thrilled because it's taken years. Cambridge University signed now an official living wage employer. So they're not paying, and they're actually signed up to slightly higher than the real living wage. No one who works now for Cambridge University, it doesn't count the colleges, but the university is paid less than £10 an hour. So we're really, really excited about that. So we've pushed that. We've got various other officers as well, such as kind of financial inclusion officers. We've got people who we employ to help with things like budgeting and also with environmental measures, so that people can ensure their house is not wasting money unnecessarily. But I'd say the other thing that we're really trying to do is to make sure that it's not just top down, because I think one of the problems, and you hear this from some of these incredibly out of touch MPs who kind of imply if everyone just did some good budgeting and kind of bought more lentils, then it would all be fine and they wouldn't be in poverty anymore. And hey, you can get your valued chicken. And we know that that isn't true. So this is also about making sure that we really work with, in a respectful way, the people who are currently suffering deprivation. And it's not about us going in and saying we are the council and we are very clever, and if you were clever like us you would all be fine. So we try to bring in things which are about people helping each other, but this is also where we've coming from with our stuff around food, because it's a realization that people just don't have enough money, and you can be a great cook and you can be a great budgeter, and if you're trying to cook for a family on a few pounds a week, it won't work. So just before the pandemic, we passed a budget. It was quite a fun budget meeting because we had Extinction Rebellion came in and they tied themselves to the balcony in the council, and it had to all be postponed because the balcony is a bit fragile. We had to come back a week later and finish off the budget. As part of that budget, we put in something like about 122,000 over 4 years for a central food distribution hub. And the idea of that was to try and get the surplus food from restaurants, supermarkets, growers, get it to one place, cook it where we needed to, and then get it out to people. And clearly that was just superseded by events, because we've now got a central food hub and 8 hubs running around the city. And we want to look at what we can do to keep that going afterwards in some form. But that, I think, is where it also come on to where a community can contribute, even where the council perhaps isn't. So those local food hubs, although we're supporting it, they're also something that's come very much from the community. It's local people in the community approaching the supermarkets, trying to get the food in to give out. And they've mainly grown out of a network of community fridges, which is just a brilliant scheme. And it is basically what it says. You find something like a progressive cafe or a community centre, and you get a fridge and a storage cupboard next to it, and people leave things and they collect things. So there are rules about what you can't give, like meat, for example. But if you've grown a bit of extra veg, you can take it, you can share it, and maybe you see a tin of something you fancy, you just take it, you just keep a log. There's no judgment, there's no gatekeeping. And it's a really great way of kind of getting food into the community. So that's something we're also trying to really encourage. But increasingly what we're finding is that anti-poverty strategy has to be across the whole council. So every policy we put in place gets assessed against equalities, against the environment, and against the anti-poverty strategy. So we're really trying to make that a whole council thing. I should also say we're building council houses rather a lot. We've got 534 already being built, and we've now developing plans to build another 1,000 over the next 10 years. So that's a really key part of it too. But it's also about the local community. And a council can do a certain amount, but if we take it all on ourselves, we don't empower the local people, the local businesses, the people who want to work with us. So there's a lot of that as well that we're trying to do. So although that's long, it's quite a short summary. So if there's more you want to know, just ask.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. That was really interesting to hear about that. If I can just comment on your council house building strategy, we contemplate such things, but because of the right to buy, how do you get away from losing all your housing stock? Because that happens, doesn't it?
Yeah,
do you hand them to housing associations, or what do you do?
You just have to factor it in, and it's awful.
Yes.
So yeah, you keep building, and then right to buy keeps hitting you. And there's all sorts of ridiculous things. So one of the things in right to buy that is just the most stupid thing is that you can't even, if you sell your council house, a council house through right to buy, you can't use the value of that whole house to build one more house. You can only use it to half the value.
Wow.
So basically you can use it for 2 more houses, but you have to match fund it. So thankfully they've made changes now to the ability of councils to borrow on their housing stock, because you've got this big asset which you couldn't borrow on. But yeah, I mean, we got enough money for 500 homes out of the devolution deal. So we've got an absolutely horrific regional mayor who really is, I think, probably he has united everyone politically, I think, in agreeing that he's completely horrific. One of the things that we managed to get out of agreeing to that was money for council houses, a big deal for the whole of our region, including 500 homes for Cambridge. So yeah, it's awful, but you just have to keep trying somehow.
Well, thank you very much, Councillor Smith, for pointing towards a lot of things that we've been also discussing slightly in the Attlesford Women's group that we have created. That is to engage more with communities and connecting that with Labour's existing food bank collections. The idea of the food hub is absolutely mind-blowing. And I was thinking whether this is a cross-party approach, or is it something, maybe something that is just for communities to come up, or this is more to do with how funds have been generated through the council. I mean, it's something that is
it's a mixture. So
yeah,
we've got, again, this is where the local community comes in. So the City Council is part of a group called the Cambridge Food Poverty Alliance, and that includes the Trussell Trust and various other groups, including this amazing group called Cambridge Sustainable Food. And they look at sustainability in that broader sense. So it's anti-food waste, but it's also about being sustainable for a whole community. So they're the ones that have led on our food hubs, and we've worked with them. Now, yes, the hubs are supported by people from across the political spectrum, but yeah, but we've come into it as a council to fund and support and to try to help. I mean, quite a lot of the food at the moment is coming from a group called Fair Share UK, which is a charity which redistributes food, but you do have to pay. And so where we've helped out partly as a council is with the staffing and the support, because CSF is quite a small charity, and suddenly they're running like 9 food hubs across the city. So we've helped with that, but we've also helped with funds to buy food from Fair Share to kind of top up the food hubs as well. So it really has, and I could see that. I mean, there's a few of us in the council who are pretty obsessed with dealing with food poverty, and that has helped. But I could
find those people in our council. And that brings on this very big question, which I don't want to drag you into, but probably another time. That is, has Cambridge signed up to ethical investment policies, and whether this can be then tied to the whole question of, the money going in for ethical investment locally, and whether that can be tied to food which as you have brought out very well, is the need of the hour. So
exactly what
it's a
terms of
large
ethical
question.
investment policies we're tied into, I couldn't tell you, but the general move. So we, I can't remember the name for it, but it'll come to me in a minute. But we're not investing in anything kind of environmentally unsound. There's a word for that, and it's gone. We're
meeting
also
SDG goals, probably from Cambridge.
Yeah, we've pledged to divest. And we're also looking potentially at community wealth building, and part of that is about ethical procurement.
Yeah.
And because we're a living wage council, one of the things we also say as part of that is that we won't employ any employers that aren't paying the living wage to people. So anyone that is doing work for us, even as a third party, has to be paying the living wage to people.
Right.
So that is a really, the living wage campaign is great, and it's one of those things that can be quite community led as well. Just going back for a second on the food poverty thing, what I would say is that can come from the community as well. It's quite, we've got obsessed councillors, but even without obsessed councillors, I think it could have got a long way. So that's something that could be really powerful from, and if you want me to send you details of kind of,
I think that would be, that's something we will definitely work on, because some of us in the group are quite passionate about that.
Yeah, really happy to
really
connect
me.
on that.
I'm into food security and food rights, so that again ties up very well. I want to thank you again. We have to sort of close your session, and if you want to stay on and enjoy the rest, then wonderful. Otherwise, we will get in touch. And thank you again to Stuart for coordinating the session with you and to bring you as a speaker, and great sort of session. Thank you.
It's lovely to be here, and seriously, you know, obviously on Zoom, everything's immediate, but I'm just up the road anyway. And, you know, I'm in normal times, I'd be kind of going down to Stortford a lot to see my parents. I'm really happy to keep connected because, you know, we're neighbours, and if Cambridge can offer you any support, please let me know.
Sure. Thank you again.
Lovely.
Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
So next speaker is Siobhan Sliman from the our very own CLP Women's Officer, but also here you're going to talk about state pension age increases, something you spoke last year as well, but you're going to update us as to what is going on in the name of equality, as you say. State pension age increases in the name of equality, tying up with our theme today, and to also brief us on Pension Reform Alliance. Just to remind you that, you know, time is very constricted. So
how long have I got, Sanjukta?
8 minutes roughly.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
Thank you.
Some of you will have heard a lot of this last year, but just to sort of recap, the state pension age rises that have been taking place. There have been 4 acts basically that have come about. 1995, which raised everybody's age, women's age to 65. And then the Pensions Act 2007, which made the provision to increase from 66 to 68 in stages from 2024 to 2046. And then 2011 Pension Act brought forward the increase in women's state pension age to 65 from 2020 to 2018. And that is also at the point which the state pension age started rising to 66. The State Pension Act or Pensions Act of 2014 brought forward the increase to 67 between 2026 and 2028. So what you can see is that over the last 20 years, there's been, well, more than 25 years, there has been 4 changes to the state pension age. And you may have heard of WASPy women. That's a generic sort of media term now given for women against state pension inequality or injustice. There are two distinct groups. There are many groups, in fact, talking about this, but the main argument thrown back to them is that, well, you wanted equality, so now you've got it. So what are you moaning about? You don't like it when it goes against you. And very, very emphatically, these groups, none of them are saying that we shouldn't have the same pension age as men. Women should not have the same pension age as men. What we're saying is that should our pension age change, we should be informed of that fact at a time when it gives us notice and sufficient time for us to mitigate for a loss. For example, a woman who thought she was going to retire in 2011 discovered in 2010 that she was going to have to wait until 2016 until she retired. And there people have said to her, you know, you should have known the government did an advert on the television involving two dogs sitting on a beach. That informed everybody that their pension age was increasing. Well, no, this lady categorically did not know. We know of people who worked for the Department of Work and Pensions who did not know that their state pension age was increasing. So it's not a case that people are disagreeing with any rises. It's the way this particular set of increases happened that has particularly grievously affected women born in the 1950s. And I would also add women born in the 1960s, because I don't feel that I had equality of opportunity throughout my working life. And I'm not saying that because I want people to feel sorry for me, but it's a fact that the decisions I made when I was 15 and told I had to go to work at 16 were based on the fact we had a very ordinary family. None of our family had ever been to university. We were all very working class people. So further education did not have the same normalcy for us as it would perhaps now. So I pooted off to work and did what a lot of people did. I got married and I had a child, and my work became it was subsumed underneath what my family needs were, which meant I didn't work to go for promotions and actively look at my pension pot, because I wasn't the one that was predominantly going to be managing the finances of our family. As it turns out, that was that was very misguided, but that was from a personal point of view. But what I'm saying is, as a woman born in the 60s, the mid 60s, I don't believe that these pension rises are any fairer to our generation either. However, had they written to me in 1995 and said, you know what, we have to put this pension age up, so you better take care of that, I might have been able to do something about it. But I only found out in 2018 that I had 7 years longer than my original state pension age rise. Now, what we've been talking about today has been a lot of community-based ideas and looking for ways to improve things on a community level. And I'm a bit stuck on how we can get something as mammoth as the state pension. How can we deal with that on a community level? I really don't know, and I wanted to throw that out to the floor, because as a campaigner with the Pension Reform Alliance, I've been on a few protests. I've written umpteen letters to various people in government, and I've met with our own MP, and She gave me the time of day, but quite categorically doesn't agree that there was anything wrong with the state pension age requirements. And my problem is that people who have made these decisions aren't aware of the impacts that they're having, and they're not taking those impacts into account. And where we are today with International Women's Day, we've got, you know, the pay gap and the pension gap, which we all know about, and those gaps are, or certainly were, slightly closing, and we were pleased to start seeing that happen. Obviously, with the pandemic and the shock to our economy and our lives, has had a knock-on effect on that, and pension companies already commenting on the impact that this is going to have on people who and their retirement plans, particularly those who were planning to retire before 2025, so imminently coming up to retirement. They said there's a 70% increase in the number of people who feel now that they can't retire before then, and 54% of those saying because they just simply cannot afford to, they can't manage it. So no one's ever interested in pensions until they get near to retirement. I don't think I was really. I was lucky enough to be advised, well advised now as it seems, to take out a personal pension when I was younger. And it was only small, but I never really did much with it until I went to work for a pensions advisor. I've sort of tried to look after it a bit better since I've learned all I've learned. And what I'd like to do is try to come up with a way of making the fight against future increases in pension age. I suppose that's the point I wanted to get across today, is there's been 4 acts in the last 25 years. There is now a regular review of state pension age. And for me, I see that as is more opportunity for the pension age to just keep being increased before I even get there. So let alone my son and his children, what's going to happen to it, you know, for them. And I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's necessary to keep increasing it. I think we need to be much more realistic about what people need when they come to retirement, particularly people on low incomes. And as we've heard today, the people on low incomes are predominantly women, because they're in those very sectors that are on low incomes, and they choose that. A lot of the time they choose that because it helps them work around their families, and that's perfectly acceptable. But we mustn't penalise women for that. And I'd like to see us make allowances for women because they bear the children, and so they have a financial impact immediately, as well as their long term from having children. And I don't say that it's I'm not man bashing when I say that needs to be recognised and allowed for. And if we're being recognised as individual and equal in our own rights, then that needs to be allowed for and not penalised. I keep saying that word penalised because that's what I feel we are often. And then what else did I want to finally ask? Well, my main ask today is to have that recognised, that because we bear the children and there's no sign of that happening, changes to that happening anytime soon, I think there should be some recognition of the fact. I really also would like them to not increase the state pension age any further. And given the pandemic and the number of people, particularly women, affected in terms of their lifetime income and what they can do about their pension now, I think it's even more important not to start talking about raising the state pension age. One of the things that's really been quite grievous in this last year is to consistently hear the government talk about over 70s being the most vulnerable, when the World Health Organization has consistently said it's over 60s that are the most vulnerable. And what this government has done, and successive governments before, has put people over 60 in a position where during this pandemic, they were forced to continue working. And because the industries that are most affected, the retail and leisure industries, are predominantly women, as well as teaching and nursing predominantly women, that means a considerable number of women would have been working way past what should have been their retirement age at a very, very, very vulnerable time in the pandemic, on the front line. But so my question is, what can we do? What can we do about, I can't get our MP to listen to us. Government isn't listening to us. The media isn't listening to us. And I would say we're definitely persistent, but what can we do locally? I'd just throw that out there to you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, for bringing some very large questions to the floor. I really think that perhaps let's hear from Hilary first, and then maybe we can combine something if we have time for any more questions, because we really have got very little time now left. Okay, big questions again from you, from being part of, Labour CLP officer as well. I think these questions can be sifted as well as discussed in greater depth and detail when we have more opportunities. Can we just ask Hilary to step in and talk about Decadescope, baby boomer view? Hilary is the vice chair of one of the vice chairs of Saffron Walden CLP. So Siobhan, if you can hold on to the questions, and by the time the questions come in, I would ask people to put them on chat so that even if we don't have the answers now, we can have a record of the chat. That's a good idea. So that we can collect those questions and answer them. So if you don't mind, Siobhan, we just move on. Not at all. Thank you again for your contribution. Hilary.
Okay, thank you very much, Sanjukta. Yeah, my talk's it's just more of a social comment talk and doesn't require questions. It's just a bit of social history, really. And I'm just going to start off with my own background for a short while, where I'm coming from. Okay, Decadescope. Women's lib, burn your bra. What's all this about? This cry came to my ears in the 1970s, but more about that later. I grew up in the 1950s in a simple country folk family. Home ownership was for the rich, so as being able to go to university. These aspirations were far out of reach for children such as we. Very few people owned a car. We didn't have electricity or heating other than coal fires. The toilet was across the backyard. Lighting was gas lamps. You can see how old I am, can't you? Life was very uncomfortable and I was often ill. Our home was a private landlord-owned cottage. Such landlords did nothing at all to improve the living standards. We had no bathrooms or hot running water. Women did not go to work. This was considered rather cheap and disgraceful. A woman's place was in the home, by the sink and the oven, and she hardly ever took her full-length pinny off. She did not have political thoughts or aspirations. A woman was expected to follow her husband's leading and vote the same as he did. Her duty was to be an obedient wife, good housekeeper, and devoted mother. One warm day, our front door was wide open. There were smartly dressed men dashing in and out. They had red rosettes on their jackets, and there were lists all over our front room table. On the front door was a notice that said committee rooms. What's going on? My mum seemed to be thoroughly enjoying all this and explained that we were near the polling station and there was an election. This was my first inkling of political activity and that things could be challenged. Into the 1960s, the cultural and social revolution was sweeping the country and Harold Wilson was swept to power for a Labour government. The number of jobs available to young single women was increasing. More girls went on to further education, and having lived away from home and with greater intellectual and financial independence, many women could now have aspirations beyond being a wife and mother. Feminism began to find a voice in society, demanding equal pay and opportunity. For the everyday village girl, though, job expectations were basically office clerk, shop assistant, nurse, hairdresser, or joining the forces. Bosses were always men. Pay was peanuts. The backdrop was the swinging 60s, and the next life changer was the availability of the contraceptive pill. Up to the minute, electrical appliances made domestic chores easier. Convenience foods were coming onto the market. Pot noodle. All these advances brought new confidence and ideas about what women might achieve. Still, men did not pull their weight in the home, and a working woman had to juggle work with managing domestic tasks. Women's work was very much the attitude. Financial matters were always handled by men, as women did not understand such things. If you've never seen the film Made in Dagenham, I thoroughly recommend this as an inspiration and great entertainment. It captures that 1960s world. I and my female colleagues one day walked out of an all-women workers' clothing factory en masse as we were wilting under the heat. The management, men, was clearly very disturbed as they then blacked out the roof and paid for everyone to have lollies and ice creams. In politics, Barbara Castle was the lady to look up to, holding top cabinet posts and being a trailblazer for women's equality. 1970s. The era of psychedelia and colour with an awful lot of orange and brown. Hemlines were at their highest, flares at their widest. Women began to learn to drive and even own a car. If you were extremely ambitious, you could make it as a Tupperware area manager. Wow. Many women dispensed with their bras as a statement of freedom, but this made matters worse, and the word ogling entered popular parlance. It was expected you should think about getting a part-time job, even if you didn't want one, and were contented to be a stay-at-home mum. So this brought the reverse pressure, and women felt failures if they were not advancing a career. I went to evening classes. In the background, the microchip was advancing, leading toward the home and office computer and Windows revolution. Still, there were definite women's and men's boundaries in all spheres of life. Pay was extremely low for the ordinary woman. The Equal Pay Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, and the Employment Protection Acts were welcome legislation in the 70s. If I'd been brave and savvy, I could have helped my own son, who, wishing to join the typewriting classes at school, he wanted to be a journalist, was refused and told that was for girls only. In 1979, the mood of the country was changing, and Margaret Thatcher became the UK's first female Prime Minister. 1980s. This is the Thatcher era, which polarised the country to love her or hate her. We were encouraged to do our own thing and be our own person and strive individually to make as much money as we could and achieve the heights of success as exemplified by Margaret. The social backdrop was one of changing fashions and great music, for example, Michael Jackson and some superb rock bands. Shoulder pads marked the epitome of the ambitious young woman. Slick black suits were everywhere. But did this mean that women were achieving higher levels of status in the job market? Certainly not in the offices in which I worked. Still, all directors were men, and certainly the managing director. The only woman on the board was the PA taking the minutes. The era of the temp worker arrived, along with hot desking, but they did not receive the part-time worker rights that we know today. The glass ceiling was very much in force. Discontent with this was rising, and a few women started their own businesses. Owning your own home was the aspiration, and of course this, in the case of couples, meant both partners wishing to go out to work to earn the required salaries. If parents, then this gave rise to childcare problems, and new legislation was brought in to enable the regulation of childminders. The percentage of women holding a part-time job was growing rapidly. Pay, savings and pensions lagged far behind that of the professional male worker, though. 1990s. The cultural backdrop became that of the Supergirl image. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the Spice Girls, Madonna, all giving the impression that today's woman was a power to be reckoned with. Girl power was the thing. Was this translating into equal opportunity in the workplace? Better workplace training was on the increase, but where I worked, few women were getting beyond lorry drivers or environment agency officers. The top strata was still dominated by men. Pay was still very poor for the technical skills expected. And employment discrimination against the mature person became a growing feature. Over 50, no chance. In the world of politics, all women shortlists gave rise to great controversy and still attract some criticism, specifically as a tool that discredits the merit system. The percentage of women in Parliament is now 34%, so something's been happening as a result. At the 1997 general election, Blair's Babes was much publicised and on newspaper front pages. Or was this another case of objectification? The Employment Rights Act of 1996 and Maternity and Parental Leave Regs of 1999 gave women additional maternity benefits and the right to return to their job after the birth of the child, a significant step forward. In other spheres, there was a great struggle for women to advance, such as to be ordained as religious ministers. Getting more visible were more women firefighters and police. In the construction industry, females in yellow jackets and hard hats were making their mark. Women were choosing to marry and have children much later in life. This gave birth to the phenomenon of the 90s man, who happily and proudly took on bigger share of domestic duties and childcare, even changing nappies. I'm going to wind off now. 2000s and ongoing. Since the dawn of the new millennium, progress for women has not been so much in neat decade identities, but a long, steady overcoming of injustices and unfairness. Gender equality and empowering women is one of the 8 Millennium Development Goals, MDGs. When women are healthy and educated, this enhances not only their own lives, but of those around them, their family, communities, countries, and globally, resulting in advancement instead of perpetuating poverty. This means that they need the same life choices that men enjoy, as the benefits ripple out beyond the woman to the further world. However, on average, women still earn less than men and still do many more hours of unpaid work. Abuse and violence is on the increase, and statistics of domestic cruelty during pandemic lockdowns, for example, does not make pretty reading. One area of women's advancement and equality is the world of sport. Years back, a women's football or cricket team was consigned to an obscure slot on a mainstream TV channel, non-mainstream TV channel. Now we can expect to see live coverage of World Cup women's cricket, football, or other sports. Equality in pay, sponsorship, and exposure are the targets. It was revealed that the United States women's soccer team was paid a quarter of the men's team despite winning their 4th World Cup in 2019 and generating more revenue than the men's team. In protest, the women's team filed a wage discrimination act against US soccer, resulting in wage and bonus increases and improved financial support. In Australia, the women's soccer team, the Matildas, also did the same and succeeded. On our UK TV screens is a much improved percentage of disabled women, weather presenters, investigative journalists, actors. That glass ceiling is beginning to crack. The World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report 2020 estimates that it will take 99.5 years to achieve gender parity at this current rate of progress. An illustration: Black women are the least likely section of society to be among the top earners in Britain, a new study has found. Did we really need a study to tell us this? Has women's ability to realise their rights and determine their life outcomes increased? Empowering women to fulfil their potential requires changes in attitudes inside the home, at the workplace, and in the community. To conclude, some encouraging inroads so far. Bishops, priests, rabbis, surgeons, judges, union leaders, head of MI5, the IMF, PSV drivers, astronauts, US Vice President, snooker referees are all now highly visible. Even Doctor Who is now a woman. My recent favourite, the first ever all-female spacewalk on the International Space Station. Love it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. I thought I was going to do the summary, but I don't think I need to do any more summaries
really
after
good.
this.
That's slightly longer than I thought. Sorry.
It's amazing how you've given us this Decadescope, and I was thinking, if my slides, which I prepared, I don't know if I can run all of them, but I want to quickly show, and for the records at least. Oliver, are you here to bear with me? I'm not going to take more than 2 minutes.
So it's only 9 minutes past 3.
Yeah.
Not like any of us have got anywhere to go at the moment, so.
Yeah. So. I just thought I'd put this beautiful sort of products, which are dolls, and they're colored dolls, that are coming into the international market, which is really where everything starts about inequality, our perceptions of color, race, and everything. And the current trend now in the South is really to promote these little dolls that is not Barbie dolls. So we've grown up with the Barbie concept and the Barbie doll, and the fairness idea is kind of dominates from where I come from. And so, to change the racist debate, we need to start from childhood. And I thought I'd put this up to show you how colored dolls are encouragingly entering the market, to give you a sense of the futurist vision that Hilary has painted with a very positive note towards the end, where she can see women becoming Doctor Who, but women playing with colored dolls now is another kind of futurist vision. And it is something that connects with what we have actually talked of throughout the session: deep structures of injustices, inequalities, indignity, sexism, racism, colorism, which is a new term that is entering again for what we have described in the Attlesford Women's Group. Let's talk of intersectionality. And when I talked of that, a lot of people wanted to know what exactly that term stands for. And I think in this session, we have shown how women's issues are so connected, not just with different kinds of issues, but across borders. That's the point. So we've talked at great length of various systemic barriers. And when Hilary wanted to talk about Millennium Development Goals, I was just waiting whether it's going to also touch on Sustainable Development Goals, which is where the future is heading. And in this list, which is going to stay on record, hopefully, and can be seen on Facebook when it all goes live, that I have listed various points on climate action and climate change that we need to really build into any kind of politics that we are talking of. And it is a prime domain of gender disparities that we are noticing. Then the third point that I wanted to raise is that the session has been fundamentally about challenging inequalities at work. And with that, we tried to connect with empowering. And the first slot of empowerment, which is a very, very curious, complex history, actually. The term empowerment itself has got a curious history behind it. The initial phases were really about looking more specifically at, say, domestic areas of parental leave, zero tolerance policies against sexual harassment at work. So it was very, very site specific. But I think the debate is now shifting, that especially with this COVID context, we have had some discussions on how it needs to move to self-improvement and greater organizational skills development. So my last two slides really relate to some local interventions that we need and how self-improvement, self-development, consciousness is tied to all the discriminatory debates we've had, which connects to our Let's End Period Poverty campaign, which I wanted to tell you that today is really a great day. Again, this we chose to celebrate and end because it's going to now go into Attlesford District Council for submission. It will lead to a public consultation. And I have invited everybody who's signed this petition to join us for another round, hopefully stimulating a discussion we've had for a public consultation very specifically to this campaign, which I'm happy that it gets linked with ideas of empowerment and self-improvement as well. I mean, I thought when Hilary was talking about sports, you know, do we have a telepathy here? Because some of my ideas in the morning, I was really thinking about UDC has a sports budget of 150 grand in capital projects. So we need to also ask whether sports itself becomes the site for building these kind of gender-specific, women-specific empowerment strategies. And you know, locally, we need to build these kind of safe and fair spaces by hooking onto sports. So if Cambridge has done community food hubs, etc., and we've seen how interesting some of the examples that came from there, to then probably see sports as a huge area where we can look at ways of defying these gender stereotypes and shift attitudes about gender roles. You gave examples of sports where women are going into, and I think this is going to help us as well. So finally, I want to tie it up with an International Women's Day. It's about global cooperation for change makers and how equal representation of women in policymaking, in boardrooms, in trade unions is really important. Because earlier today, you know, I was trying to make this point at the London Labour Forum for International Women's Day, that we are seeing global investments, we are seeing cross-border investments. You know, if you talk of Cambridge, you can see the great influence of China's investment, even in London, for instance. So these are key areas where the whole discourse on labor, women's labor will shift. And it's important that we kind of lobby for an advocate for women's voices and experiences to be showcased, whether it's the media or whether it's at community level, like we've discussed today. So there's a lot that can be done. And I want to stop sharing and say a big thank you to everybody who's been here. And I would urge that, let's spread the word of joining Uttlesford Women's Group and talk more there, perhaps, and build from there. So I want to thank everybody again, and I wish you well, a very good afternoon. I also want to specifically thank the exec behind supporting this. There's Andrew Sampson, who's here with me, helping me with communicating and publicizing this event. There's Oliver there. I want to also thank you, Oliver, for being behind the scene, just as much Dermot has held on to very patiently in spite of, I just wanted to keep to time, but we've had a lot today to talk of, and I think we covered well within the time. And thank you all for being so patient and participating, and for all the questions and comments. And of course, a big thank you again to Stuart for bringing our two key speakers from Cambridge and Sheffield. So thank you again. And again, I say, we will sort of keep up the conversation. If you've had any questions, please, you've probably got it on chat, or, we are there to answer in different forums that we hope to hold in future. And at the end. Thank you. Siobhan, again, yeah, you would like to.
Sanjukta, well done.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjukta.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
See you all again soon, hopefully.